if we need to add water to our humidifier or we need to replace our desiccant. But what we're going to do is we are going to find out what ambient H2O is, and we're also going to find out if we remove all of it with the desiccant, what is that value? And then if we add 100%, if we go 100% through the humidifier, what is that value? So what's the range of the H2O control in this instrument? And do we need to change any chemicals to improve that? Okay, so I passed this test. Always nice. It indicates that my humidifier is adding to my ambient H2O, and I'm also able to remove more than 80% of the ambient water concentration in the air. CO2 limits and match does the exact same thing, just for CO2. So the first thing we do is we send air through the desiccant and the humidifier, because both the desiccant and the humidifier have the possibility of holding water or holding CO2. And so we don't want that extra CO2 in there to affect our measurements. So we go ahead and we just send some CO2-free air through them pretty quickly. And then we say, okay, what is ambient? So I'm about to find out what ambient CO2 is in this room. And I'm expecting it to be pretty high. And then once I know what ambient is, then I will know what the maximum amount of CO2 removal is and whether I can add CO2. That tells me whether my CO2 column is working properly. I'm also checking my zeros in this case, just to make sure that if I have a analyzer offset, I know about that. Remember, we talked about how if we are calculating photosynthesis, we need to know that the CO2R and CO2S are really zero when we say they are. Otherwise, it can cause an offset of CO2. So this worked for me. I was able, my CO2R was low. I was able to add to CO2, and then I was able to remove it as well. Chamber leak is exactly what it sounds like. It's another test related to how the chamber is leaking. Most chambers are not very leaky. We don't want them to be, but there's always a little bit. And so we just find out if there is a bit of a leak, what is it? So I have a 0.3% leak. I'm not worried about a 0.3% leak. That's not a problem at all. But if my chamber was closed, or if my chamber was open instead of closed, then I would have potentially a very large leak. And then this test would stop, actually. It would say, no, I can't do that. The chamber is open. The chamber fan is just testing to see what the range of fan control is. So we normally control at 10,000 RPM unless we're working with a plant that's sensitive to wind. But we would like to know that we could control at a wider range if we needed to do that. So that's what the chamber fan test does. So you can see that this set of warm-up tests in 10 to 15 minutes allows us to find out exactly what went ahead and started our measurements. We would have the possibility that there was a problem and we didn't know about it, and then our data didn't look good or was completely unusable. So we don't want to ever be in that situation. We always want to run the warm-up tests before we start our measurements. No failures so far? Okay. Okay, so I didn't have any failure in the chamber fan. I'm going to go to the heat exchanger. Now this is the noisy test, because what I'm going to do is try a few different set points for whether I can lower the temperature in the chamber and whether I can raise the temperature in the chamber. And because of that, it's going to be a little bit noisy. It usually picks something. It says it's 3 random T exchange set points. I've noticed that it likes to do somewhere around 20 and 35 C. It changes a little bit, but it seems to like those, maybe with the idea that if you were at room temperature, if you were at 25 C, then it would be up and down from there. So Israel and Shannon tell me that your instrument failed one test, the overpressure test. So we'll go back to that one once we're done with going through all of these, and we'll talk about what it is and what it means and whether you need to be concerned about it. But okay. The nice thing about the LI 6800 warm-up system test, for those of you who use the LI 6400, you probably remember the Chapter 4 checklist, which was push this button and change this knob and move this and open this and close this and adjust this. And so there was a lot of doing things to get the same information about whether all the hardware and the software was working. With the LA 6800, since it's automatic, it allows us to just tell it to do what we want it to do, and then it focuses on that, and we can let it go and do that, and we could start working on, you know, preparing our plants for our measurement, or, you know, going and getting a drink of water, or whatever it was that we needed or wanted to do. So we allow the instrument to do a little bit more of the work for us.
It just remembers the last time.
I started working with the LI 6400, just like Shannon did. And so both of us, when we started using the LI 6800 and realized how much more effective and efficient the warm-up tests, both of us were, that was a nice little detail that both of us were happy about. So my last test, wobble, and so we're just making sure that it doesn't do that. And the reason we want to make sure it doesn't wobble is that we don't want it to do this. And so if it does this, then obviously that's going to change the way the pressure valve is functioning. And we think we're getting one pressure and we're not. So we're just checking to make sure that there's no wobble in that valve. Just like we're checking to make sure all valves can open and close, we also want to make sure that nothing wobbles. And indeed, nothing wobbled for me, so that's good. Before we go and we talk about some of the things that we would see if we ran the warm-up tests together, all together by pressing the overall start button rather than looking at them individually, we do have a couple of other tests down here, categories of tests rather. The controller tests are exactly what they sound like. What we do is we go through a lot of different control options for flow, for fan, for the heat exchanger, for temperature control, CO2R, CO2S. We don't run these every day. They take between 30 and 40 minutes, and we don't run them every day. We might run them at the beginning of a measurement season. So we have been growing some plants and now we're getting ready. We're going to start measuring them, and we just want to make sure that everything on our instrument is working. That's when we might run the controller tests, but we don't run them every single day. It's not needed, and it's 30 minutes that you could be doing measurements rather than doing tests. The other thing that you see down here, if you have a fluorometer, is that there are some fluorometer tests, and those are also not something that we run every day. Again, we typically only run them if we are concerned about our fluorometer or we are starting our measurement season to make sure that everything is working properly. So I didn't have any failures of my warm-up test, but I'm going to go back up to the main starting warm-up test screen, and you can see that it says test name, last performed, pass, warned, failed. So what does this mean? Well, passed and failed, that's easy. We all understand what passed and failed means. Warned means, well, you know, it's a little bit outside of the range that we were wanting it to be, but it's not so much that we're really concerned about. It's something to keep an eye on. If you consistently warn on a test, it might indicate that you need to look into it further. But it doesn't mean I can't do my measurements that day. Often it means this isn't quite where it should be, but here's something you can do to fix it. So in the warnings and failures box, if I had one, it would tell me what test, what the warning was, and what the suggestion was. So I think we had a chamber pressure warning and a CO2 zero warning on your instrument. It's done? Oh, yes. Okay, excellent. So we've got a couple of different failures. So we have a warning that P chamber was not quite 0.1, and it was said it was 0.086. That's not really a major problem. I'm not concerned about that. We do see that CO2R is, instead of being between -2 and 5, is -10.1 for yours. So that's not between -2 and 5. What we might need to do is go ahead and check your CO2 zero, and we'll talk about how to check and adjust your CO2 zero when we do maintenance calibration, but that might be something we need to look into. The other thing I see is that your clock is not quite right, and it looks like you have a clock offset. So before we do any measurements, we should take care of that simply because otherwise our data file